International negotiations, especially with something as complex and critical as we're seeing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it can feel like trying to understand a black box. You're probably listening today because, like me, you really want to grasp what's actually happening behind closed doors, beyond the public statements, and all the speculation we hear about what a resolution might look like.
Absolutely. It's a really multi-layered situation. So many factors at play. To get a good handle on the real dynamics, we need to look at the people who have been directly involved in bridging those divides.
Exactly. And that's what we're focusing on today, diving into the perspective of someone who's been right at the heart of these incredibly high-stakes discussions. Martin Griffiths. He's a former British diplomat and UN Undersecretary General, and has been instrumental in negotiating the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And what's key here is he has direct experience negotiating with both the Russians and Ukrainians. This isn't just someone analyzing from afar. He's been at the table.
His perspective is so valuable. As a seasoned mediator, he's seen the intricacies of these talks firsthand. And what he says offers a really unique window into the real obstacles and potential paths forward, which often differ quite a bit from what's discussed publicly.
Yeah, and what we're drawing on today are excerpts from a really compelling BBC News interview with Mr. Griffiths. Think of this as your direct line to understanding some of the key realities of how negotiations in this super challenging environment actually play out. We want to cut through all that usual public rhetoric. Our mission, if you will, is to extract those vital lessons from his firsthand experience. So those subtle but really crucial aspects that often get overlooked or missed, you ready to get a clearer picture of what it actually takes to try and find some common ground in a situation like this?
Let's do it.
Okay, so Griffiths has this fundamental principle he keeps coming back to about successful mediation. He basically says the best approach is often to, quote, shut up instead of talking publicly about where we're going, unquote. Now, this is interesting, especially in today's world where information is constant and everywhere. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, what's fascinating is that public diplomacy, even though it appears transparent, might actually create more barriers to successful negotiation than it solves.
Interesting.
Just imagine you're trying to find a compromise, and every single potential move you make is instantly scrutinized and debated publicly. It makes it really tough for negotiators to show any flexibility or offer concessions, even small ones, because they immediately face huge public and political pressure. It's like trying to perform delicate surgery under a stadium floodlight with everybody shouting their opinions.
I love that analogy. So
Yeah.
you're saying Griffiths is highlighting the need for what he calls a safe environment for these discussions to really work. What does that environment actually look like? Why is it so crucial to getting any kind of agreement?
A safe environment in this context means that discussions can happen confidentially, away from the constant pressure of public opinion and media scrutiny. This allows for a level of candor and the exploration of different options that you just wouldn't get if every word could be splashed across the headlines. It allows for necessary compromises, whether political, commercial, or even humanitarian, to be considered and potentially agreed upon without the immediate risk of facing public backlash or accusations of weakness.
That really contrasts with the 24/7 news cycle we're also used to, where every single diplomatic move is instantly analyzed and often politicized. I mean, it makes you wonder whether that constant public scrutiny is ultimately helping or actually hindering the process of finding solutions in conflicts like this.
Absolutely. It makes you think about the balance between transparency and the need for private space in high-stakes diplomacy. I mean, public awareness is important, accountability is crucial, but what Griffiths is suggesting is that those critical phases of negotiation often require a degree of confidentiality to build trust and allow for real give and take between the parties.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Griffiths talks about the early stages of this current conflict, and he seems to have a fairly positive view of the U.S.'s initial efforts to try and facilitate talks. He specifically mentions the energy that the U.S. brought to the table, pointing to meetings in Saudi Arabia and Sue Wickoff's presence in Russia. What do you think he's getting at when he talks about energy in that early phase?
I think energy in this case refers to that initial proactive diplomatic push, the high-level engagement that aimed to set up meetings and establish communication channels between the involved parties. It shows a real effort to kickstart that negotiation process and signal a commitment to finding a diplomatic path forward. It's about creating that momentum and showing you're willing to actively engage.
It's that early willingness to jump in.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so Griffiths then goes on to describe his experience meeting directly with Sergei Lavrov in Moscow back in April 2022. I mean, that sounds like a significant encounter given Lavrov's role.
Yeah.
What were your key takeaways from how Griffiths describes that meeting?
A few things stand out. First, the timing. This is early in the conflict, which adds a certain context to the discussions. Also, Griffiths mentions that he's long seen Lavrov as an extraordinary player based on his own time at the UN. So this isn't a brand new relationship. There's history there, which likely shaped his approach and understanding going into it.
It sounds like the meeting itself was, well, pretty intense.
Yeah.
Griffiths mentions Lavrov laughing and criticizing what he calls Griffiths' naivety, all while raising familiar Russian talking points about their perceived games, the situation with soldiers, and the accusations of horrible fascism in Ukraine. It doesn't sound like a particularly, shall we say, productive exchange.
No, you're right. And Griffiths actually acknowledges this. He describes it as, quote, not exactly constructive, but rather, quote, a laying of the hands on each other.
Interesting way to put it.
It suggests an initial encounter where the focus was more on establishing that contact, maybe signaling positions, rather than actually making any immediate progress.
Yeah.
Lavrov's comments, they clearly reflect the official Russian narrative at that time. I mean, it highlights just how big the gulf in perspectives was.
But what's interesting is Griffiths goes on to talk about his work with the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Vershinin, which seems to have been more productive. And he offers this, well, kind of blunt assessment of Lavrov at that time, suggesting he was likely not interested in progress. What do you make of that contrast in his experiences with these two Russian officials?
That's a great point. It could indicate that there were differing levels of openness to negotiation within the Russian government at that early stage. Maybe different individuals had different mandates or different priorities. It's also possible Lavrov's role at that point was more about conveying the official, more rigid position, while Vershinin might have been tasked with exploring more practical paths for discussion. Whatever it was, Griffith's ability to adapt and actually build a working relationship with Vershinin seems to have been key.
Yeah, it seems to have opened some doors. This brings us to a crucial point, and one that's often debated. The question of good faith in negotiation. Griffiths himself admits that he's worried about whether Russia has negotiated in good faith. What are the implications of that kind of concern if there are going to be any future attempts at negotiation?
Look, if one party's perceived as not negotiating in good faith, it undermines the entire process, right? It erodes trust, breeds suspicion, and makes finding common ground or reaching any meaningful agreements incredibly difficult. It really raises questions about the other party's commitment to the process, whether they're genuinely invested in something that might be seen as disingenuous. And the fact that Griffiths expresses this worry, it suggests it was a persistent and significant challenge throughout his involvement.
It's a big hurdle to overcome. Let's look at a more specific example, the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This was a pretty significant diplomatic achievement, and Griffiths was right at the center of it. He mentions that the groundwork for this started around the same time as that meeting with Lavrov, and eventually led to the signing in Istanbul in July. This feels like a really tangible case study in navigating these complex dynamics, right?
Absolutely. It shows the concrete hurdles and all the intricacies involved in trying to negotiate amidst an ongoing conflict. Griffiths actually mentions his earlier involvement in the Azovstal-Mariupol operation, which shows that he'd already established communication lines with both Kiev and the Russian military on specific humanitarian issues.
So those lines were open. But he points out this really interesting shift in the nature of the challenges when the focus moved from more military matters to the political aspects of the grain initiative. He says the foreign ministry became more involved and more suspicious, as he put it, of potential concessions. And this created this kind of rivalry with the defense ministry, with whom he seems to have had a better working relationship. This sounds like a whole other layer of complexity. You're not just negotiating between countries, but within them as well.
Yeah, you're negotiating internal politics. What's really insightful here is that we get a glimpse into those internal dynamics within the Russian government, the differing perspectives and levels of suspicion between the defense ministry, which was probably more focused on the practical aspects of the military situation, and the foreign ministry, which likely had a broader political lens that added a whole other layer of difficulty to the negotiations. So Griffiths was having to navigate these internal tensions in Moscow while also trying to bridge that gap between Russia and Ukraine. Talk about a challenge.
Yeah, talk about walking a tightrope. And he emphasizes that ultimately, quote, the Kremlin was behind every single decision, unquote. He says President Putin was all over this, with established channels going straight to the top. It really underscores how centralized decision-making is on the Russian side.
It really does. And it also shows just how important it is to understand those power structures within each negotiating party. Griffiths seems to have adopted this approach of maintaining neutrality and distance amidst these internal dynamics in Moscow. That was likely a deliberate and probably essential strategy for a mediator operating in that kind of environment.
A lot of moving pieces to keep track of. Now, when thinking about future negotiations, Griffiths brings up a concerning point. He talks about public criticism and what he calls factually incorrect statements coming from the U.S. administration about the parties involved, stating it was simply not true and doesn't help. Why is that kind of public messaging so potentially damaging from the viewpoint of someone who's trying to mediate a resolution?
Because it circles back to that point about the need for a safe and impartial environment for these kinds of talks. Public criticism, especially if it's seen as biased or inaccurate, can really damage trust between the sides. It can be perceived as taking sides, which is the opposite of what mediation is all about.
Yeah.
Impartiality and neutrality can also make everyone dig in their heels, making compromise even more difficult.
So it can have a chilling effect on the whole
Right.
process.
Right.
He also reiterates, that even though a mediator will naturally have their own views, maybe even their own national interests, sticking to that principle of impartiality and neutrality when dealing with everyone is absolutely crucial. But what I found even more interesting is he stresses the need to focus on the conditions and positions that will likely lead to a lasting ceasefire and what comes after that, acknowledging that ceasefires in general often don't last. This seems to shift the focus from just stopping the immediate fighting to the much bigger and much more complex task of building a lasting peace.
100%. I mean, a ceasefire is often just a pause in the fighting. What Griffiths is emphasizing is the need to address the root causes of the conflict. You have to create conditions that make it less likely that violence will flare up again. That requires a much deeper understanding of the core issues and a willingness to actually negotiate on those fundamental points, not just the surface stuff.
That's a much bigger ask.
It is.
Now, on a slightly more optimistic note, Griffiths observes that the U.S. and others have recently shifted to focusing on negotiating the outcomes. Why is that shift in focus, even if it's subtle, potentially important for what might happen next?
It's significant because it suggests a move away from focusing solely on that immediate end to the fighting. It's about moving toward addressing those more fundamental questions that need resolving to achieve a lasting peace. Negotiating the outcomes means a deeper engagement with the political, the security, even the humanitarian dimensions of the conflict. It means recognizing that a sustainable peace requires more than just signing a ceasefire agreement. You need to address those underlying issues that are fueling the conflict in the first place.
It's about the long game. So, to sum up for you, our listener, drawing from Martin Griffiths' experience, we've seen just how critical private diplomacy can be to create the space for those tough compromises that need to be made. We've also gained some insight into the huge challenge of navigating not only the differences between the negotiating parties, but also the internal complexities and dynamics within each side. And at the heart of all of this is that fundamental principle of impartiality and neutrality, which is vital for any mediator who hopes to facilitate a successful resolution. This really gives us a much more nuanced and realistic understanding of how incredibly challenging these situations are, especially when those doors are closed.
Absolutely. When you start to understand these behind-the-scenes realities, you get a much richer and more informed view of the ongoing conflict and the potential pathways towards a resolution. It helps you move beyond simplistic narratives and acknowledge that complex web of factors that are always at play in these high-stakes negotiations.
It's like peeling back the layers of the onion.
Yeah, exactly.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider as you go about your day. Given how much emphasis Martin Griffiths puts on establishing the conditions for a lasting peace, and not just a ceasefire, what do you think are the most critical factors that need to be put in place in the current Russia-Ukraine conflict to create those truly sustainable conditions? Think beyond the immediate goal of stopping the violence. Consider the long-term implications for both sides, and even the wider international landscape. Food for thought.
A lot to think about there.